Unprecedented Times is my debut literary novel. It is a campus novel community story set against the apocalyptic background of the COVID-19 pandemic that follows a group of college freshmen trying to make their way in the world and kind of navigate these existential questions. Unprecedented Times was like kind of like the talking point that everyone used to like articulate this sense of like that like the narratives we have been given seem to be falling apart around us. And I wanted to play with that in the book because for these protagonists, like many of whom are like queer young people, first generation Americans, for a variety of reasons, they believe that like the experiences that they're having are like the first of their kind, that there's no guidebook, there's no blueprint. And part of that is like true to how it feels to be young. I think part of that is also just a little bit of ahistorical ignorance and kind of hubris on the part of the characters too. And part of like I guess like the gag of the book is that the narrator finds out that in some ways like her political circumstances are harder for her to escape than she realizes, and that like a lot of the experiences that she's having are not unprecedented but have been had by like many women before her. So I think the title is meant to be a little tongue in cheek, like it's meant to make a reference to the COVID time period, but also ask these questions about how much of our experiences are new, how much of them are products of like larger forces that tend to be cyclical. I think that the pandemic like unmoored a lot of people from what they had used to keep their bearings, including like certain relationships they've had maybe with like linear progress in their lives or like a certain relationship that you're supposed to have with like your employer and sticking to a path. And I think that like when like the temporal markers of progress kind of just like went away, a lot of people began to see how much of like the organizing forces of their lives may have actually been arbitrary or not as satisfying to them. So for the protagonist, like it was once very important for them to have like a clear progression. A lot of these students, because they're Stanford students, are like described to be pretty insufferable high achievers for whom like they've only had this idea of linear advancement, which is something that Rishi also feels strongly as like a child of immigrants, that her life also needs to be better than that of her parents, and that will just like keep going like a game of like leapfrog or something. And then the pandemic, I think, quickly disabuses her of that notion and like makes her realize that things take maybe more time than she realized, or that like things tend to be more cyclical. I think that life on college campuses, like the experience of time, is unique. And I haven't experienced anything like it in post grad. I think part of the joy of a campus novel is that there are so many arbitrary constraints that create like a very unique set of circumstances. For example, like because there's like a 10-week long semester, things just like automatically feel a little compressed, and like a situation shift can like accelerate and then explode within a few weeks. Like Rishi and Georgia, even though they've only known each other for a few months before essentially like U-hauling in to move together, have nonetheless spent so many waking hours and have just put so many hours into their friendship. It fosters a sense of intimacy. I think that there's just like a haste and a warp speed of college, and like such a like rush of like exposure to new experiences that happens at a higher density than I think for these characters has happened at any other point in their lives previously. And I think like to go from that like rate of new experiences to like what Rishi describes as like a black hole feeling of COVID, that there's like no path forward, like no escape. It is like really jarring. I wrote that scene with like all like the micro choices that Rishi makes on how to present herself, whether it's like tell this like one high achieving guy what she was like in high school or how to introduce herself to her roommate. I hope that it would kind of create a visceral, both like secondhand embarrassment and also nostalgia for the reader of like what the first day of college feels like when you're trying to like completely reinvent and like like create a new personhood. I think that the 2 a.m. part was probably maybe the most earnest thing that she says in that statement, because I do think that what she's describing is like that burning desire to reach like a level of like intimacy and understanding with people that she hasn't felt was accessible to her before. And one of the scenes that I enjoyed most in the book is that it's not at 2 a.m., but there's a scene where her and Georgia take a long walk late at night and tell each other their entire life stories. I'm sure that people have wanted to be close with each other and to be fully known by their loved ones forever. But I think that there is like a heightened hunger for this, maybe in an era of like social media where a lot of like relationships feel like a little bit more transactional and performed. Or maybe it's just like this is her first time like being around like other young queer people who she deeply relates with, whereas she felt like an arm's distance from everyone in Florida. But I think she is like hungry to like have her brain completely gobbled up by someone else and to do it for someone else. And like she maybe feels like those that kind of intimacy is only capable is only allowable, I would say, in like sort of like altered states, whether it's like her and her friends like on drugs together, or if it's just like the insanity that happens like when you're sleep deprived. I thought long and hard about how to mark the progression of time in this book, and I tried out like many different things. I think that I ultimately landed on seasons for a couple of reasons. One was because that is like how college semesters are set up, or at least the school that I went to, it was like a fall and winter and spring and summer like term instead of like just two. And I also thought that that progression of time, because it happens twice, like kind of creates like a more like cohesive sense of growth for the reader. And like my goal with this book was to create what feels like a very long character arc in a limited amount of time, so that like when you're reading about things like in fall part two, you feel like nostalgic for things that happen in fall part one, or there are like moments that like kind of rhyme. And the other reason that I picked seasons was because in part two, when they move to the farm commune, like seasons become much more relevant to their lives because they're like thinking about like growing and harvesting and stuff.